Version 2, The Spinosaurus Universe, or The Wachowskis and the Monster, a novella by Peyton Strange. Over the period of a few years, an unexplainable anomaly spread across the Earth like a virus, resurrecting all the extinct animal species to have ever lived on the planet. It was slow at first, and more or less went unnoticed, but then suddenly exploded in its frequency of species revivals, and people quickly took notice of what had previously been missed by the masses. Due to the anomaly, which was all the synergistic event was ever known as, extinct animals, including the dinosaurs, went from being extinct to being a rarity to suddenly appearing everywhere around the planet in mass and on an ever faster and faster scale. As more and more once lost species appeared, civilization could not hold itself together, and it was slowly overwhelmed until it finally broke apart and collapsed altogether. Survival for all species on the now overcrowded planet became a toss-up as a free-for-all fight for survival took over the world. The Earth could barely sustain so many competing ecosystems, each completely different from the other, once separated by millions of years each in its environment at once. Over 500 million years worth of complex life and over 1 billion years of basic life all fought for the same necessary resources that quickly became dangerously limited. Yet life hung on. As years passed, the species that managed to survive adapted to their new environments. They settled into their new, somewhat unstable but functioning ecosystems, and the world calmed back into order following the planet's 6th mass extinction as new food webs and relationships between species were established. Among them, pockets of modern human survivors clung on as well. Yet the anomaly, the resurrection event of all extinct animals, which vanished again as silently as it appeared, did one other thing. It didn't just resurrect all the extinct animal species that had once lived on Earth. It also changed some individual specimens from each species, physically altering them, and very rarely giving some individuals of those once lost species the ability of higher thinking, intelligence equal to a human's, larger body size, and even the ability to speak. These rare exceptions were referred to by some as the variants. There was never any explanation from scientists for what the anomaly was, how it did what it did, or how it even happened. It had, and that was all that really mattered. This story begins 21 years after human civilization fell, and the survivors were damned to have to survive in this post-apocalyptic future, and follows the Wachowski family in their day-to-day lives in their new hostile world. Lives that are about to be interrupted in the most terrifying way possible when Adam Wachowski makes a startling discovery and a grave mistake. A mistake made possible because a terrorist group known as the True Patriots, who were living hidden in plain sight in a nearby community of survivors who called themselves the Patriots, a group completely unknown to the Wachowskis, created a monster. A monster created from a mix of animals, using the DNA from those rare variants the anomaly created to give intelligence equal to a human, which was designed to excel in combat, strike fear into those by its very appearance, that, after a failed attack against another community of survivors the True Patriots disdained and wanted to see burn, was now free from the control by the only ones who could put a leash on him. Though injured, their hybrid dinosaur was now on a collision course with the Wachowski family, who were now caught in the aftermath of a decade-long war between survivor communities. A war where one side created a monster. 1. It should be noted that 300 years ago, when the anomaly destroyed humanity's civilization, that many people quickly formed into various groups, many of which combined to form the first communities after everything fell. This story occurred 21 years later, During the days, the roots that became the continental-wide coalition of today were only just still sprouting into the soil, when small proxy groups were still combining to form larger ones, or were still at war with each other, to establish dominance, power, and territory. In those days, there were scattered communities and smaller-scale unities, but nothing like what would come in the following decades. While some made an effort to preserve the story of themselves or their groups amid this, many were not focused on it, and today, all these years later, we are left with tantalizing fragments of those tumultuous years after the anomaly. Now, with centuries having passed, we, the historians of the coalition that arose from all those wars and groups combining, are finally writing these stories down and reconstructing them so we can learn from them. This is not Volume 2 of the collection we're compiling on our coalition's early history. Rather, this is a narrative that is worth recounting, but does not fit into the main work we are putting together. Even all these years later, the following events remain infamous in their viciousness and brutality. In those early years, the inverse of what we just described was still just as prevalent. Not everyone had joined with large groups. Some still survived alone. The Wachowski family were one such group. They lived alone and isolated, unaware of the many nearby settlements of survivor groups. They were unaware of the united communities, unaware of the patriots, and unaware of the two speakers. All their conflicts happened while the Wachowski remained unaware and went about their daily routines. They were unaware of the war fought between the united communities and the patriots 11 years after the fall, and unaware of the terror group, the true patriots, that arose among extremists in the patriots community following their reorganization after they lost the war, and unaware that they created dangerous hybrid dinosaurs for their effort to wipe out the united communities. This reconstruction of what happened when the Wachowskis found the gaze of version 2, his name and status, he was version 2 of their designs, locked on them following his escape from the true patriots, is pulled entirely from the accounts of two witnesses to the following horrifying events: Maeve Wachowski and the hybrid dinosaur version 2 himself, who both later told this story in full so it could be recorded as a cautionary tale for what evil people can unwittingly unleash on anyone, even those who were not their initial targets. In this case, an innocent family who were just caught up in the aftermath when version 2 was unleashed and allowed to roam free, but still a brainwashed, bloodthirsty monster who thought he only wanted to kill. At this time, version 2 was still under the influence of the brainwashing the true patriots had done to him. His mind was not his own. There was a little corner where his true personality, inherited from the variant's DNA used to create him, was aware, but it could not overpower and stop the other. He was a prisoner in his own mind, only able to watch as the brainwashed side of him made his body do things he didn't want to do but was helpless to stop. This story has become almost something of a fireside legend in the last 3 centuries since the events took place. Here we set the record straight with the true events. With that all said, we present the most accurate reconstruction possible of the time the Wachowskis encountered the monster, beginning with the aftermath of the true patriots' swan song attack on the united communities of Ohio. The attack on the town had failed. Those who created the hybrids, a secretive terrorist group that hid in plain sight among others in their community, were dead. And he was almost killed as well. He, a hybrid dinosaur that looked more like a creature crafted to be scarier in appearance than anything natural that had evolved with time, had escaped the failed assault and managed to slip into a flowing body of water, wounded but still alive. He was as smart as any human, and he had been brainwashed by his creators to think killing was the only thing he should want to do, and the only thing he could enjoy in life. He was one of 5 hybrids made by the terrorist group. Of those 5, 1 was dead, 2 were unaccounted for following their unexpected escape, and 1, the first one, had gone rogue. That one had turned on those who created it, sided with the very town they attacked, and had been the one to seriously injure version 2, the name of the hybrid, since he was his creator's literal second version. He had his throat torn out during the battle by his fellow hybrid, version 1, who had given himself a proper name after stealing its freedom, Shadow, feigned death, and escaped from the community when no one was looking. From there, he had crawled to a body of water, a river, and slipped into its depths. He let its current carry him away, far from the community, away from his dead former masters, and into a much larger body of water. From there, everything that had happened next was a murky blur for version 2, even as he had crawled along the lake bottom and came nearer to the lake shore, opposite to the side where he had been washed into it by the river. Nothing became clearer as he pulled himself out of the deeper water and came close to the surface. It all remained murky as his vision began fading. He had gills, so there was no danger of drowning if he passed out, but there were many animals in the lake that could prove dangerous to him in that vulnerable of a state. If he could just reach the surface before he lost all his strength. A large hand with clawed fingers erupted out of the water suddenly, and a large form pulled itself to shore. The back spikes appeared first, followed by the plated armor that ran along version 2's back. He'd snapped his adestus teeth at any fish or snakes he saw weakly, even that sapping his strength. While at the bottom of the lake, he'd been forced to use his spiky tail like a club to scare away a risottus that had gotten too close for comfort. It had swam away in the murky water, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Version 2 had crawled along the bottom until he made it to shore on the opposite side. The hybrid dinosaur crawled out of the deep water and collapsed in the shallow water near shore, laying on thick clayish mud, the small waves sloshing over him, his nose above the water, one of his hands clasped against the massive wound in his neck that was still oozing blood. It was a parting gift from Shadow, though version 2 only knew him as version 1. He hissed and spat a few bloody globs of water out of his mouth before passing out. He was unconscious, but he was still alive. The last thing version 2 saw before passing out was a lone man with a rifle, not a true patriot, rather just some dark-haired survivor with a red vest on, walking out of the trees and onto the beach towards him, looking like he couldn't believe what had just crawled out of the lake. A rusted, long-forgotten shopping cart lay sprawled on its side in the middle of the street, dried leaves dangling and stuck between its bars, swaying in the gentle breeze. Others blew past without becoming stuck and continued across the silent street. The empty street in question passed through the outskirts of a small, long-abandoned town. One that was lined with silent and ever-watchful abandoned buildings that had remained mostly unchanged over the decades since civilization was overwhelmed and then collapsed. Most of them were old brick and stone ones that had actually remained unchanged for roughly a century or more. No cars drove down the street, and no school children in a hurry crossed the road without really looking both ways, though they pretended to. Now, the only thing that crossed the street on a constant basis were dried leaves blowing in the summer and fall breeze. Or maybe the occasional raccoon hurrying across the road while hoping it didn't become lunch for some pterosaur circling overhead, or some other carnivore that was light on its feet. Unless, of course, it happened to be one of the nearly bear-sized prehistoric raccoons that now roamed again. Those would be more likely to eat the pterosaur. The sun was still low in the east. It was an early fall morning after all, but it was higher in the sky than the tops of the buildings and the surrounding trees. Despite it being early in the morning, Adam Wachowski, having hiked several miles already, emerged from the forest that bordered the town and passed between two of the buildings, stepping out onto the road and approaching one of the unassuming buildings that had been looted roughly 2 decades ago when people preemptively decided that civilization was already over. It was an old drugstore that no longer had a door. It hadn't had one for years. Adam stepped inside, some leaves that had blown inside the doorway crunching under his boots, while others that were still damp from the rain the night before stuck to them. He slung his rifle over his left shoulder and slid his bag off his other one. After listening for a moment, he concluded that the store was empty and proceeded inside, moving a few rows of shelves down from the door and entering the aisle he desired. After walking roughly halfway down the row, he came to the only set of shelves in the entire store that weren't empty. He dropped his bag to the ground and began examining his secret stash. The middle of a store that had been completely looted over 2 decades ago was really the perfect place to hide one. Who would expect there to be supplies in there after so many years? Not that there were many people left scavenging nowadays anyway. Not that there were many people left in general. Those that were had formed into large groups and communities. Adam was a rare exception in that regard. His cards just had not played out that way. He didn't have a community. He had a cabin and his family. They were on their own when it came to survival. Adam examined what was stashed on the shelves. There were sealed medications that were likely too old to be of any real use should they be needed. There were some boxes of ammo for his rifle. There were some other basic odds and ends as well, like a full and ready-to-go first aid kit, extra solar-powered walkie-talkies that were still in their original packaging, backup fishing rods and fully stocked tackle boxes, and so on. Today, Adam only took 2 dust-coated boxes of ammunition, which were both more than 20 years old, and dropped them into his bag. There was also a shaving kit sitting among the various items on the shelf, a can of sealed shaving cream and a basic razor, which also was still sealed in its packaging, and considering the thick beard on his face, it was something that Adam certainly could have made use of. But it was the only one left. There was no replacement blades, and he decided not to use it until it was absolutely needed. Shaving with a razor was something much better than doing it with a knife or similar object, so for now it would stay on the shelf. Better to leave it here instead of at home so he wasn't constantly tempted to use it, Adam figured. Nonetheless, Adam ran his hand through his beard and really thought about it, picking up the package the razor was in and looking it over as well. Who would have ever thought that he'd ever live in a world where a pristine razor would be so tempting of a sight? "Maybe after the cold weather is over, I'll come back for you," Adam said after a few seconds, setting the package back down on the shelf. A soft, low growling coming from within the store made Adam pause before he could look at anything else. He stiffened, his gaze lowering towards the ground as he slowly crouched and looked through the bottom shelf at the aisle over. 4 large, fur-coated legs, bottomed with paws that adorned 4 thick toes and short but sharp-looking claw-like hooves, were walking down the neighboring aisle. The legs passed Adam and continued down the aisle, walking away from the door and deeper into the store. The size and color pattern on the fur betrayed the animal's identity. It was an Andrewsarchus, a carnivore from the Middle Eocene, the apex land-dwelling predator of its day. Adam realized it must have followed him into the store. He imagined its head looking side to side as it prowled down the aisle, its nose twitching as it caught his scent, foamy drool dripping over its lips, the muscles in its legs and bodies slightly wobbling with each heavy step. Deciding he didn't want to tussle with such a large and agile predator, he'd seen large bears back off from one more than once, Adam closed his bag and slowly stood back up, silently backing up towards the door, keeping an eye on the end of the row of shelves, making sure the carnivore didn't come around to his side. It was tall enough to look a human in the eye, and Adam didn't want to experience that stare down, nor what would follow after. He continued backing up towards the door until he reached it, and it was only then that he turned around. He hadn't seen the Andrewsarchus again after glimpsing its legs, but he knew it was still prowling around between the shelves somewhere towards the back of the store. It could stay as far as Adam was concerned. It would likely be weeks before he came back, and he doubted it would still be there by then. Adam backed up to the door and exited the building before turning around and stepping back onto the street, managing to do so without drawing the attention of the prehistoric predator. He turned to hurry back down the silent street as the wind stirred up scattered brown leaves around him, not so much as hearing any sign he was still being followed by the Andrewsarchus. A crow squawked at him from the roof of one of the buildings, flying away a moment later. It wasn't the only thing flying. High up in the sky, circling far overhead, were several large pterosaurs. Their squawks echoed faintly down from the sky like a whisper. The wind helped carry the sounds of the flying animals down to the ground. All the while, it also whistled through the empty buildings and brushed through the leaves on the trees, adding sound to an otherwise silent world. What sound there was, like the calls of the flying reptiles, sounded like ghosts. Adam passed through the alley between the same two buildings and again re-entered the forest on his path, the same one he'd hiked to the town for the ammo boxes. With fallen, multicolored leaves crunching underfoot, he set off back the way he had come, heading for home. Aside from the wind, the world was silent around him and felt devoid of human life outside of the buildings that still dotted the world. It almost seemed as if human civilization had never been there, and that the earth was left wild and untamed as it had been for most of its history. Though that was to be expected with extinction, that the evidence and presence of a species was to be erased. Until they had returned, it was the same with the dinosaurs. It was like they had never even been there. Ghosts truly were real. Adam didn't know if he believed in an afterlife, but he did believe in a higher power in the universe. He didn't think death was the end. In his mind, he felt that something had to happen after life ended. Maybe you were born again as something new. Maybe you entered a higher plane of existence. Maybe you became a ghost. Maybe you waited with your species in purgatory until you got a second shot, like everything that ever went extinct had gotten 2 decades before. Maybe it was the doom of all life to reincarnate over and over again and watch as all species it lived as die off one by one until life itself came to a final end. And even if none of that was true, the world still felt haunted, like ghosts were roaming everywhere. Every time Adam heard a dinosaur roar, it was like he was hearing the bellowing cry of an ancient ghost. Seeing the empty world and the silent remnants of civilization not only made Adam have those depressing thoughts and made him feel the same way, but also made him have the same feelings he did when he watched it all come to an end so long before. In the new world that was a crazy mix of the animal life from all eras, from as recent as the Holocene to the Pleistocene, to the Cretaceous, to the Jurassic, Triassic, and all other eras before, during, and after, all the way back through the Paleozoic to the first era of complex life. A world so mixed that one day you might run into a member of the Dimetrodon genus, only to turn around the next day and run into a tribe of early humans such as Homo habilis. Then, only to turn around again the next day and come face to face with some apex predator from the Jurassic. All the while, maybe going all those days without seeing animals from the modern world, even something as simple as a chipmunk. In that world, those feelings were likely normal for many. At least he supposed they were, as was the feeling of living in a world full of ghosts. As a human, when alone with his thoughts, Adam sometimes felt out of place in such a world. Did humans and dinosaurs and other long-vanished prehistoric life, once separated by millions of years each, really have the right to exist together? The universe sure seemed to think so, or whatever the anomaly had been seemed to. Though that also didn't seem to be limited to prehistoric extinct animals. Animals humans had lived alongside of, and driven to extinction, were back as well. Adam remembered, shortly before civilization fully fell apart, hearing about living Tasmanian tigers being found again, along with living heath hens and Bahi River dolphins, all among the countless animals from all of the eras of Earth's animal history, from the ancient Cambrian, which birthed the first truly complex life, to the modern Holocene, that seemingly just came back out of nowhere. He had heard the same thing about the dodo bird as well. It was like everything was getting a do-over. Before the true severity of what was coming had hit everyone, the cryptozoology community had been having a heyday with all the sightings. They were not the only extinct animals man had once lived alongside of that had been resurrected from oblivion. Adam had once, years prior, seen a Caspian tiger crossing the forest trail he was currently walking on. Another ghost revived from extinction by whatever had revived the dinosaurs and all other prehistoric fauna. Seeing a tiger in the forests of western Ohio confirmed to Adam one important piece of information that he had previously suspected: that whatever the animal that was revived might have been, it was not necessarily placed where they were found naturally in the past. Since Adam also knew that rarely the revived animals could talk, the idea of what a talking tiger might have to say was at least amusing to him. Though what did not amuse Adam was the knowledge that there were modern-day predators lurking in the forest that were as dangerous as any Utah raptor or other decently sized carnivorous prehistoric animal would be. Entelodont was a particularly nasty one to encounter. Thankfully, it had been years since Adam had last seen any. Bullets didn't seem to hurt those animals at all. Adam wondered sometimes if they were too stupid to even realize they felt pain, and since they more than earned the nickname Hell Pig when encounters with them occurred, they tended to be anything but fun. As his walk through the forest continued, Adam passed the skeleton of a triceratops that lay just off his path, its horns and empty eye sockets pointed at him. Another ghost he'd seen several hundred times now. One that had been, in life, just as dangerous as any carnivore. And now, in death, one with unblinking empty eyes that never missed anything. They took in every change, big or small, fast or slow, good or bad. Adam always felt that the skull was watching him whenever he passed it. The one truly positive upside the end of civilization had in Adam's mind? The air was the cleanest it had been in his lifetime. That was nice at least. Silently, Adam continued to follow his usual path back through the forest as the morning dragged on and the sun rose higher, leaves falling around him with each gust of the fall breeze. They seemed to be the only things moving. The forest also seemed to be devoid of life on this early fall morning, Adam noted. It wasn't just the lack of modern humans. It seemed very few animals were around at all. The ever-present breeze now seemed to give Adam a physical chill. The temperature had been low enough that Adam wore a red vest for warmth. Bright red, which meant that it did not do any favors in regards to camouflaging. He now wished he'd worn something a little warmer due to the uncanny chill that morning had produced, but at least needing to be camouflaged did not seem to be needed that morning. Adam's route through the forest spanned several miles, from where his family was waiting to the abandoned town's outskirts, and he picked his pace up as he now just wanted to be home. It was a lonely walk on the best of days, and this one seemed to not be the best. The lack of life just felt off. Sometimes Adam brought his son with him on these trips, but not today. If that was a good or bad decision remained to be seen. Adam's trail, formed by years of constant usage, took him through the deep forests of the region of Ohio he called home. As he passed over the top of a large hill, he caught a glimpse of a distant old iron viaduct that would never again have a train roar across its high trestle. He would lose sight of it quickly because his trail then descended a hill and entered more forest on what had once been state-owned land. It then looped through the hills and trees, and eventually he came out along the shore of a large lake. From here, his path followed along the tree line at the edge of the sorry excuses for beaches that ran along the lake shore, until it finally snaked off from the shoreline, away from the water, and worked over to the cabin where his family lived. The cabin itself was in a large forest clearing, a very large one that had been cleared of all trees decades before by Adam's father, who was the one that had built the cabin. Adam had known once civilization began crumbling that it would be a good place to go to ride out the worst of it due to the isolation. He'd originally only intended to stay for a few weeks at the cabin with his then-girlfriend, but that hadn't been what ended up happening. In the clearing was a very large pond. To talk to someone on the other side, you had to shout, stocked with fish, and in some of the open space around the cabin were some patches of crops that had been laid down by the two inhabitants after the apocalypse. They had been able to make the whole area virtually self-sustaining, so Adam and his now wife had lived there since civilization was overwhelmed and destroyed by the reappearance of prehistoric life. Together, Adam and his wife had raised their kids there. They had spent around half their lives there, and it was probably the place they'd spend the rest of their lives, too. They had also been officially married. Around a year after the collapse, on one of the rare times they left the cabin together, they'd met a priest still manning his church, giving sermons to any who came, and he'd married them at their request. The church was burned by someone around a year later. The bones of the preacher, with a bullet hole in his skull, were amid the rubble. Both Adam and his wife were now nearly in their mid-40s, having only been in their early 20s when the world decided to go from 0 to 100 over the course of a few months. The anomaly that started the apocalypse, still didn't make any sense. But those days when things were changing were long gone, and in the end the details didn't really matter. Maybe the universe had glitched, maybe God, whom Adam didn't even know if he believed in after seeing many things since the apocalypse started that made him doubt the existence of a higher being, had decided he liked his prehistoric creations more than mankind and wanted them back instead. Whatever the reason, the anomaly had happened, and the result of it was the world that the people left alive, the good and bad ones, had to live in. As Adam's general hiking routine continued, his mind began to wander, as any mind does when an activity is repeated over and over without change or incident. That morning, his mind wandered back to the dark night on an isolated country road when he first saw a living dinosaur, over 20 years before. He'd been driving home, taking an isolated route that traveled down dark, unmaintained county roads that slinked and wormed between the thick forest and isolated farm fields. The only lights for miles were his headlights. There were no cars on these roads at that time of night. He'd never seen one on them in the day either. And so as he drove, he ended up only half paying attention to the road, entering a light trance of highway hypnosis and going off muscle memory of when to make turns. So when the massive shape, a moment resembling a scene from some cryptid-themed horror movie, appeared in his headlights ahead on the road, he didn't register it right away. However, once his brain snapped to attention, Adam had slammed his car's brake pedal to the floor. His vehicle skidded to a stop on the gravel road, less than 10 feet from the massive, spike-coated, four-legged animal. His jaw dropped, and he had gazed wide-eyed at the massive shape that was eyeing him idly and without concern, munching the plants in its mouth just like any cow would. Adam did not know it at the time, but what he was looking at was a dinosaur. An Ankylosaurus, to be exact. He didn't know that, though. All he knew was that some massive, unknown animal that looked like it had walked out of a movie was standing on the road, right in front of his car, in the middle of nowhere, at night. Adam had heard rumors, mostly on online chat rooms and other social media, of supposed dinosaur sightings, but there was no genuine evidence for that. While some of the fuzzy trail camera pictures did look shockingly well made, everyone just laughed and assumed it was some new online trend or hoax that people, mostly anti-government conspiracy theorists or religious extremists, were jumping on. Some even thought it was part of some elaborate marketing campaign. And at that moment, on that country road, the thought of it being a living dinosaur did not even cross Adam's mind. The Ankylosaurus had, after a few seconds of eyeing the car, turned its uninterested gaze away and began to meander across the road into the field on the opposite side. Adam stayed frozen as it crossed the road, and he stayed frozen even when the animal's clubbed tail swung into his front bumper, shaking the car and leaving a massive dent, despite the swing having just been an idle one with no force put into it. The dinosaur paid no mind to what its tail had struck, though. It just stepped across the ditch and into the field of beans on Adam's left side. Then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness like it was never there. Like it was a ghost, a snapshot, or residual echo from 65 million years before. After sitting in shock for roughly half an hour, Adam finally shook his head, let up on the brake, and slowly continued down the road. When he got home, it was almost 2 a.m, and, still in shock, Adam just told his parents the dent came from a mailbox that belonged to an abandoned house in the middle of the woods he had hit while taking a turn around a corner on the middle of a nowhere country road too fast. He had to say something that they'd believed to explain the damage, and they did believe him. Either way, Adam was still the one who had to pay for the damages. Looking back on the incident years later, Adam was grateful it had been some herbivorous dinosaur that paid him no mind instead of acting aggressive due to feeling threatened, that he had happened upon on that country road, and not some hungry Tyrannosaurus Rex or similar large carnivore that might have been a little more interested in him. Even a Utah raptor would have been a very dangerous thing to have come across that night. As Adam continued walking just inside the tree line, now having reached the eroding, scraggly shoreline of the lake, his mind still wandering away to distant memories and unresolved mysteries, he was passing one of the smaller beaches, which was made up of a sticky mix of clay and mud instead of sand, when he heard a massive splash and turned to face the water. Expecting to see maybe an osprey fly off with a fish or maybe some critter swimming away, his bag slipped from his shoulder and fell to the ground when he laid eyes on what was emerging from the water. He couldn't believe or comprehend what he was seeing, and he froze as he gazed at it. The thing that was crawling out of the lake, having made the splash as it surfaced, was like a dinosaur from a nightmare. It was all black, covered in spikes, adorned with the very recognizable killing toe claws of a raptor on each foot, had unusually long arms for a dinosaur, and had the freakiest, most bizarre, undinosaur-looking teeth and tooth structure Adam had ever seen. It also had a single, glowing yellow eye. The other eye socket was just an empty, bloody space. It looked wrong, alien even. It was more like an actual lake monster than it was a dinosaur. The dinosaur collapsed in the water and laid there, seemingly out of strength. Cautiously, Adam slung the rifle off his shoulder and walked out of the tree line. The dinosaur's single, pupilless-looking eye looked up at him for a moment before it slid shut. The small waves sloshed against the creature's side, mixing with the blood that was oozing from a disgusting-looking wound on its neck. Adam had never seen a bite like it. The animal was still breathing, its nose above the shallow water, but Adam took a step back when he saw the gills on its neck, shaking his head just like he did that night he saw the Ankylosaurus as thoughts flooded through his mind. What was this thing? What kind of dinosaur had gills? Certainly not one Adam had ever seen, heard of, or read about. He felt like that would have been something scientists would have taken note of if they'd found fossils of the species before the apocalypse. He stood, rooted to the spot, just looking at the thing. After he thought it over for a few seconds, he raised his rifle and aimed at the dinosaur's head. It was better this way. Not only was this unknown thing a potential threat to his family, but it was also clearly suffering. Best to just end the animal's pain here and now. Besides, if it somehow healed, then it was definitely a potential threat, especially since Adam and his family didn't live far from the lake and made trips to it frequently. It offered more water-based resources than the pond next to their cabin did. The animal presented another threat in a world that already had too many, and Adam wouldn't risk it recovering. One reason Adam and his family had survived was because Adam always eliminated potential threats as soon as he saw them, an attitude that had proved more fruitful far more times than it had backfired. Wanting to make sure the bullet got through what looked like thick armor on the dinosaur's head, which looked like the plated armor that was found on Devonian-era placoderms, another thing scientists would have definitely took notice of if they'd found fossils of the species, Adam took a step closer and all but pressed the gun muzzle against the animal's skull. He pulled the trigger and discharged the bullet right into the middle of the animal's head. The shot rang out loud and echoed clearly across the lake. Satisfied, Adam lowered the gun, discharged the spent shell, and turned to walk back into the tree line. He entered the trees and grabbed the bag that he had dropped. He didn't see that the Dunkleosteus armor covering version 2's head had stopped the bullet. He didn't see that as he was walking away, that the bullet slipped out of the spot it had lodged in version 2's head and fell into the water. And he also didn't see version 2's single eye slide back open briefly. Version 2, which was the only name the man-made animal had ever been given, locked his gaze on the human who had tried to kill him and snarled softly before passing back out. As Adam looked back one more time, the animal looked, and as far as he was concerned, it was dead. To be continued. That does it for Chapter 1 of Version 2, a spin-off of my novel, The Spinosaurus. Unlike The Spinosaurus, this one is still only a rough draft. I was actually even still making edits as I was reading it. But if you enjoyed and are curious to see more, check out the older reading of almost the entire earlier draft from a few years ago. It hasn't changed much, and I narrated 5 hours of the story in that one. It's the first 2 acts. I'll link it at the top of the description and in the cards at the very end. Also, sometime next month, I'm planning to release a remaster of that. It'll be this new recording in the place of the original Chapter 1 recording, the rest of the old one, and then more of it that I narrated after I released that big video. So if you want to see even more, just stick around for that. But either way, please give it a listen. If you like horror, I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll find it is a wonderfully creepy story set in this post-apocalyptic world you just glimpsed, admittedly, a whole lot of setup for, with a lot of focus on building tension and dread and really letting you get to know all the characters really well, which was something that was really important to me when I wrote this story. I really wanted you to know the characters. And of course, I would love feedback from you, if you listen to just this one or the big one, all of it. Also, check out the other videos linked at the end if you want to see more stories by me set in this universe or otherwise. And please just tell me what you think. I listen to all feedback, and just thank you so much for giving the first chapter of my book a listen. Writing's always been a huge passion of mine, so the fact people are taking time out of their day to listen to something I made truly means the world. Thank you very much.